Welcome to Resilience Unravelled, featuring scientists, practitioners, experts and everyday people with knowledge, tips, experience and great stories to share to help you get a grip of your life. We'll give you insights into a range of subjects, including reducing your stress, improving your emotional intelligence, health and well-being, and controlling your negative thoughts. By doing this, you'll be able to improve your resilience, confidence, control, and perform better every day to live a more productive and purposeful life. For a free resilience ebook, listen through to the end for details. Here's your host, Dr. Russell Thackeray.
So I was asked recently whether there was such a thing as a resilient relationship. And it just makes sense to think that resilience can be resilient, because actually, if you think about the definition of resilience, it's all about bouncing back when things get tough. So in other words, if something happened, you sort of need to recover from it in some sort of way. And the more I began to think about it, the more I thought it really did follow our model of personal relationships and personal resilience, where people bounce back, but also a good relationship weathers the storm. It's amazing how many relationships get stronger during times of adversity. There's some relationships that don't survive troubles and difficulties, but it is amazing when you have a good team, when you have a good sort of working relationship or team sort of style, spirit, personal relationship, how you can sort of weather most of what life throws at you. But it's also important, in any sort of relationship, to be able to think about resilience in terms of understanding the things that can drain away the resilience it has within your relationship. And of course, like all sort of personal resilience, relationships need the sort of capacity building side of it, investing in the relationship when times are good, to make sure that when things get tough, you've got a way of being able to manage the difficulties, manage the challenges, manage the stress that can come from whatever life is starting to throw at you. So thinking about relationships to start off with, I was going to focus quite broadly today on personal relationships and work-based relationships, really, because I think they're both similar at this stage. But I think it's something I'm going to delve into a bit more depth in the future, pulling apart work relationships first, perhaps, and then investigating some personal relationships, sort of married relationships, that sort of thing, family relationships, kids, wives, parents, all that sort of stuff in a lot more detail. But I thought today let's start with a sort of generic overview to sort of explain where I'm coming from in a way. So I think let's start at the very beginning. I think when we first start to put a relationship together, let's say it's a personal relationship, it does stagger me, especially when you talk to younger people, how much, maybe I shouldn't be surprised by this, but how much we're still driven by lust, by this idea of types, by this idea of bonding together really in the pursuit of actually having a relationship where perhaps children are concerned, that they're the sort of the primary focus, maybe for one party in that relationship, certainly. But I think also as time goes on, some people have second relationships, third relationships. You find that people maybe who are more mature start to look for more companionship. They start to look for a team member. They start to move away from that type idea. And I think we often find that looking for a type restricts and limits the sort of unusual, quirky, deep relationships that can come from actually not having a fixed idea of what you want. So I think the starting point for any sort of relationship is to begin to understand who you are and to understand what you're looking for. And it's always great to have a set of criteria. I was chatting recently to a friend of mine who was having a profile written for one of the online dating companies. And she started by thinking, well, what is it what does she want? What is it she wanted for herself? What did she want in a partner? And she wrote a list of about 17 things. And once she'd written that list, she sort of put it online or thought about it for herself, and she began to assess everybody against that list of criteria. Well, the problem, of course, was after a month, and she still hadn't had any sort of bites or dates or anything. The problem was we looked at the criteria and realised that it was such a specific list, such an uncompromising list, that actually it was going to be impossible for anyone to meet someone with all those criteria. So I think it's always important to make sure that you have the negotiables and the non-negotiables, because I think what you have to realise is that finding a person that's going to suit you in life, You're never really going to find the perfect person. Part of building a great relationship is the work you do together to create the relationship that you want with each other. And I think as you mature into a relationship, you realise that there are compromises on both sides. And the key to a good relationship is the degree to which both sides compromises. It's not about one side compromising at the expense of the other. You often find one partner will go into a relationship thinking there are clearly things wrong with that other person, and I will be able to change them. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, because most people really don't change as much as you would perhaps want, and maybe as much as perhaps you'd like. So often it's worth thinking, if there's something specifically that you don't want in a person, and one of the things really to watch out for are degrees of perfectionism and degrees of over-control. And if you read many women's magazines, and I have to say that my wife and I do enjoy reading the problem pages, but it's amazing how often you'll see this thing where you'll have one party is over-controlling and drives the other partner away from wider relationships. And I think it's one of the things to watch, is that you don't end up with a relationship that's so intense between two people, particularly in a marriage or a partnership or something, that it excludes other people. Because the secret of building a good sustaining relationship, once you've found the person you're looking for, is to make sure that there are other people within it. It can become too intense, it can become too much to expect from a relationship just to sustain it for two people. So it's important that you have room for yourself, room for the relationship, and if you have kids, obviously room and time to make sure you have built relationships with those people as well. Because kids can be a source of immense joy, but also a source of immense stress. It can create pressure and issues for most relationships when you start to throw the dynamic of children into any sort of relationship, especially if you have more than one, because the fun and the joy and the excitement and the stress and the challenge multiplies the more children you seem to have. So it is worth thinking that through. And we often find ourselves at certain stages in our lives, that I think it's called the sandwich generation, maybe 40 to 60, where you have demanding kids and sometimes demanding parents as well. And it's really important, therefore, that you've got a really strong inner relationship with your own wife and partner, or husband and partner, so you can have someone who can be a soulmate, someone who have as a great team member, so you pair of you can face challenges together. And one of the things to bear in mind, therefore, is we've got to invest in these relationships to make them work. So when things are going well, it's important to make sure that we have the energy to spend with each other. That way, we're not being overly stressed by things about the other person, that we've sort of had that maturity of thinking in the relationship where we work out what annoys us or irritates us or drives us nuts about our partner, and the sort of compromises needed to say, well, how can you remove those things or change them, and where do I need to change as well? And it led me to think many years ago about this idea of a happy ever after contract. And it's something that I know some very successful couples have tried, and it's really a very simple idea where you basically sit down and work out, say every 5 to 7 years, what it is you're attempting to achieve together, where you're going. It's like in business terms, a sort of strategy paper, where basically you're saying, well, this is what we're really great at, our strengths. This is where we actually could be better, or our weaknesses, our development areas. And this is actually the sort of negotiables or non-negotiables that we need to fix. What am I prepared to bring to this relationship? But also, where am I prepared to compromise? Where am I prepared to think about things I need to change, and sort of negotiate those things with my partner? And I think the point of this is then we can have something we can review once a year and say, well, how are we doing? And I think often we can be in a relationship and lose some of that resilience because we never really reimagine, we never really bring that initial relationship back to life, where when we first got together it was all fun and dramatic exciting, perhaps more lustful, perhaps more physically based. And as time's rolled on, then we've started to perhaps get a bit over familiar and a bit over comfortable with each other. And I know a lot of relationship counsellors talk about this idea of, date night, and date nights can be great for relationships, but they can also be torture as well. And I think you only need a date night if you want to create a physical contrivance where you sit together and actually talk about stuff. And the thing is, if you're not practiced at doing that, it's very, very difficult to make those sorts of things work. So I think what you're trying to do with a happy ever after contract is have a yearly sit down, a yearly think about where you're going and what life's all about, and how you together as a team within your relationship are going to face the challenges that life throws at you. And it's really important these days because actually with the demands of more and more anxiety states, so the way that Britain's moving and the US is moving at the moment, turbulence is more clearly evident in the world than it has been for quite a while. The sort of economies are creating ambiguity, work-life balances, and the way work's moving is actually changing things to be more unstable. And dare I say, even the way the high street's operating means that some of the familiar is starting to disappear around us. And actually, as it disappears, that pace of change is picking up. And it's really important for us to modernise that relationship, to make sure that we're using all the sort of communication channels around us appropriately, but making sure that we still spend time to really engage face-to-face, one-on-one, and make sure you have time for each other. It is one of those classic things that when you talk about people who've fallen out of touch with each other, they don't do the simple things. They don't do that sending a text every lunchtime or touching base once or twice a day just to see how someone is. That random thoughtfulness that every now and then can be really lovely. Just sending a text saying that you're thinking of someone. It's one of those things that helps sustain a relationship. And it was the sort of thing we did right at the beginning of times together when we first got hitched up or whatever it might be. And actually, as time rolls on, that thoughtlessness thoughtlessness sort of creeps in, and it's not because we're being deliberately difficult. It's just because the all-consuming passion seems to have gone maybe a little bit, and it's not because it's not there. It's just because we perhaps don't express it as much. I mean, the sources of stress also within relationships and families and such like mean that also our attention is diverted away from sometimes that heart, that team right at the centre of the family unit. And we're diffused, looking at parents, as I said, children, job stresses and such like. And it's important, I think, to sit down and have a summit of the way you work. And making sure that summit, the happy ever after contract, is at the heart of your relationship and actually extends to your parents. So you have a clear relationship with your parents where the boundaries aren't crossed. It can be clear what you want and expect from them, and the same way with children as well. It's said that this current crop of children are more sensitive and more demanding than other previous generations, and that can only be due to parenting. And I think it's actually clear that to bring up children who are more resilient, we have to let them fail, we have to let them learn from those successes. And it's the same with relationships. We have to sort of say, well, there will be times with our children where they're not going to like us, they're not going to be happy with what we say, and do you know what? We've got to do that parent bit where we accept that we're not going to be popular. And that's the same with relationships as well, with our partners. We have to accept there will be times when we're not going to get on, but it mustn't rock the inner stability of things, because we do change. People change slowly over the course of time. And the thing about most people is that we're susceptible to risk, we're susceptible to distraction, and it makes sense that you have that sort of relationship with your partner who feels you so much, as I said earlier, where you can come and talk about anything. And one of the key things that you must have on any happy ever after contract is you must be able to talk about everything. It doesn't mean that you're going to agree on everything, but it means that you shouldn't be taking things off the table because you're worried about protecting the person, or you shouldn't be talking about, or you should be worried about talking about something that's a thought or a feeling that is important to worry you, but for some reason hasn't been expressed. Because actually, if you can't trust your partner, then that's a sort of an issue. Now, in a world where one or two marriages end in divorce, it is interesting how often we face crises in relationships, and people often split up and then regret for some reason why that happened, and often get back together again. And it does make sense to make sure that if you are splitting, you're doing it because you want to, not by accident. Like you're not falling into affairs because you just not really looked after the first relationship and then expect another one to be better. Because if you're going to reform a new relationship, you've got to learn the lessons from the first one. And that is making you more resilient and increasing the chances that further relationships improve. And that doesn't seem to be the case because second marriages, for example, have a higher divorce rate than first marriages. So it seems that we're not making ourselves more wise through relationships that haven't worked so well. So I think it's important to be taking lessons, life lessons and resilience lessons from what's going on around us. We have to get things wrong in order to sit down, think about it, make it up and make our relationship stronger. And I think that's absolutely the key. I think work relationships are somewhat different. I mean, you often are working with people you don't necessarily want to work with. And you often end up with a very controlling boss, or a bullying boss, or a victim-like boss, and you're perhaps the problem, or people who are more highly sensitive, or people who are demanding or difficult, or customers who are here, there, and everywhere. And I think at the heart of it, if you want to have a strong relationship with someone, you've got to have resilience in yourself. You've got to accept that you don't always need to be bent out of shape by the people around you, unless you sort of handed over power. And it is the case, I think, that we don't take enough accountability for the relationships we have with other people. We don't recognise that actually the place to start thinking about, the persons to start thinking about when we have a relationship is ourselves. And I think it's, the more we build ourselves up, the more we understand ourselves, the more we recognise ourselves and recognise where we are failing or getting things wrong, and then putting them right, the more we actually have the skills, the life skills, the experience, the wherewithal to be able to apply that and work that with other people. Because actually, as soon as you put more than one person together, you've got politics with people, you've got vested interest, you've got a negotiation that always needs to take place. And it's very hard to actually build an adult relationship with someone else at work when you're being a victim, or you're acting in a sort of childlike state, or you're so desperate to be liked so that you're prepared to compromise your morals and your beliefs and your ethics just on the sort of altar of being popular. And I think it's really important that you become more accountable with yourself in the way that you manage relationships. You become accountable for yourself for the things you get right, and maybe the things that you need to develop and think about. So I think this has been a bit of an overview on some of the areas I want to maybe investigate in a bit more depth. We're going to have a couple of guests and think about that. But basically, I think the idea of a resilient relationship models or mirrors this sort of idea of personal resilience, where we have these stages of breakup, breakdown, and then renewal and rebouncing back. That doesn't mean divorce, by the way. That just means that the relationship actually sometimes breaks in order to move forward. It also can evolve at a more conscious level, and using things like this sort of review process can help you. So I'm going to call a halt to that today now, and put some blogs and some other information on the site and see what you think. And there'll be a LinkedIn question as well, because I'm interested in your views about relationships and how they're working out, and see how things roll forward. So until the next edition, I wish you happy relationships and a thriving life.
We hope you found today's podcast useful. If you did, why not subscribe and listen to our other podcasts? We would love it if you could leave us a review. To access our resilience coaching, contact us at info@qedod.com. And finally, if you'd like to download our free resilience ebook, go to qedod.com/free ebook. Thanks for listening.